A deadline comes and goes for radical rebels in Syria to evacuate. What does this mean for a ceasefire deal aimed at protecting millions of civilians? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the Idlib buffer zone. Monday was supposed to be when fighters linked to Al-Qaeda withdrew from a 20-kilometre stretch of land in Idlib province. But according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the militants stayed. The Syrian regime's foreign minister is not pleased, and he gave this warning. If Russia confirms the facts on the ground, then what was meant to be a conflict-free buffer zone will turn into the site of a very bloody battle. With so many lives at stake, do the militant groups have a strategy, or are they preparing for a last stand? That debate in a moment, but first this report by Shoaib Hassan.
It was the deal to herald the beginning of the end of the Syrian war. The Sochi Agreement, negotiated between Turkey and Russia, set up a secure buffer zone in Idlib province. But it now appears to be falling apart. Opposition fighters there, particularly the latest incarnation of Al-Qaeda's Al-Nusra Front, now called Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham or HTS, have refused to leave the area. That, as Syrian forces and their Russian allies prepare to move in.
We cannot remain silent towards the current situation in Idlib. If the Nusra Front refuses to commit to this agreement.
Located in northern Syria on the border with Turkey, Idlib province is the last major rebel stronghold. It's controlled mainly by HTS, while another major rebel group, the National Liberation Front, also occupies some areas. Currently, there are at least 50,000 fighters there, but there are also 3 million civilians living in Idlib. They are likely to be caught in a humanitarian crisis if fighting starts, as Syrian and Russian forces converge on the region. The agreement to create a buffer zone was reached at a conference in the Russian city of Sochi. It called for the rebels to withdraw from the province with a 20-kilometre wide demilitarized zone. The UN called it a major achievement.
But for now, we are pleased that there is the escalation in one major area, Idlib. And now that we have this deal, there is no reason not to move forward expeditiously with the political process.
Initially, the rebels complied with the deal by pulling back heavy artillery as stipulated. But since then, they have refused to move out altogether. And Idlib's residents are under no illusion as to what could happen next.
We don't know what will happen later. We don't feel secure. We were already very disappointed during this revolution, and in the end, we don't have any trust in anyone, nor in any deal.
So, can Turkey and Russia ensure that the deal is complied with? Or could Idlib civilians soon face the same terror and destruction as the rest of Syria? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in the studio is Syrian-American activist Rania Kaisar, who's with the Syrian Humanitarian Institute for National Empowerment. Alongside her is international relations professor Ahmed Qasim Khan, who's at Altenbosch University. In London, we have journalist and Syrian analyst Danny Makki, and in Moscow, Yuri Barmin, a Middle East analyst with the Russian International Affairs Council. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Rania, good to have you here in studio, in person. The last time we spoke, you were in Idlib.
Yes.
What's it like? Tell me.
It's a humanitarian catastrophe right now. The poverty rate has risen up to, I want to say, more than 30%. The average income of human beings in Syria is not more than $100 to $120, while the average costs of living expenses exceeds $250. So we are reaching high levels of poverty. Crime rate is becoming very high. There's a lot of crimes taking place in Idlib and around Idlib. And the situation, as far as people are concerned, we're still very scared of the Russians. We don't trust them. We saw what they did in the south. We saw how they made amends, or they tried to make amends with the Syrian people in the south. And then just 2 days ago, 120 people got wrongfully arrested. And this is in Daraa.
In the context of the war, people will say, well, a bloodbath was averted. So while there might be big problems, obviously, it's not perfect. The ceasefire has held and things are relatively okay. Would you accept that?
Relatively okay for now. Like I said, the Syrian people do not trust the Russians, nor do they trust the Iranians. We do trust the Turkish government. We believe that if they say we will be protected, then we will be protected. But that doesn't mean that everybody knows that, because you have to remember something. The Syrian people, they don't have TV, and we don't have electricity all the time. So we don't get to watch the news a lot. And we just know that Russia might hit us anytime. It depends on what America says. That's what they say.
Danny Maki, as another Syrian on this panel, would you agree with what Rania is saying?
I mean, I probably would to an extent, but I would fail to see where 23 million Syrians, how all of them trust the Turkish government. You've got to remember how polarized this conflict is. You have Syrians who have been supporting the government, you've got Syrians who are supporting the opposition, Syrians who are in the middle. So there is a number of different segments. So it's unfair to say that all of them don't have TV. In fact, lots of them do have TV and lots of them do follow the news. It's difficult because you've got this situation in Idlib where you have potentially 3 million Syrians, and it is almost a different reality from what's happening in different parts of the country. So it is difficult to balance that out. But I would definitely say that Idlib is one of the worst areas in Syria at the moment for services and for poverty. And the fact that the longer this de-escalation zone and this ceasefire continues, the better it will be for the humanitarian situation in Idlib. That goes without saying, absolutely.
Yuri Barmin, how are the Russians looking at this, given that groups such as Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, have not left? They've not fully disarmed. Are the Russians thinking at some point we're going to have to go in and bombard this place again because this is not holding?
Sure. Well, of course, this is always continued to be an option B for Russia in Idlib. But for the time being, given the statements that are coming from the Kremlin today, one day after the kind of the deadline on the Idlib deal, Russians are saying that they are happy with the way Turkey is handling the demilitarized zone around Idlib. Of course, they're saying that there are lots of caveats here, but more or less the deal is holding, and Turkey managed to get the groups out of the demilitarized zone. Although, of course, I'm also a little skeptical here myself, because we know that the demilitarized zone area, including the groups like HTS in this area, most of them never even had heavy arms within what is today the demilitarized zone. They would normally deploy those arms before the fight and withdraw it later. So I'm seeing a lot of things that make me skeptical about this deal. But Russians are saying that the deal is holding.
Ahmed Kasimhan, if it gets to the point where Turkey cannot influence enough of these rebel groups to play their part, would they actually engage with them? For example, HTS, Al-Qaeda linked. Would Turkey actually fight them if they refuse to leave and they refuse to disarm?
Well, that's a question whose fate will be decided between a rock and a hard place, I have to say. If circumstances force Turkey to do so, it will. But I'm not sure if Turkey is going to search for the fight, if that's the word to be used. That is why I'm not really in a position to comment on the exact answer of that question. What I could say, though, is that if the situation dictates that, Turkey is not going to refrain from fighting with these groups. However, we also have to keep in mind that this, if it happens, inevitably calls in the cavalry in this case, being the Russians.
Rania, tell Yuri Barmin why you, and I guess a big portion of the Syrian population in Idlib, why you don't trust the Russians. I don't expect Yuri to be representative of all Russians, but I'd be interested to hear you tell him directly why you don't trust them.
Okay. Mr. Yuri, it's because of what you guys did in Daraa. After the reconciliation process took place in Daraa, just about 5 days ago or 6 days ago, 120 people got arrested wrongfully for no reason at all. Even doctors, nurses, and the allegations that were made against them were completely false. Not only that, there's at least, I don't want to give a number here, but I want to say that thousands of people are now being displaced in South Daraa, and they have no place to go. And I'm sure you guys know about the catastrophe of Al-Rukman camp and how people there are dying on a daily basis because of malnutrition. When people from Daraa, when the military groups in Daraa sat down with the Russians and they discussed with them the peaceful reconciliation or the political process, they were promised things that they were never given. They were promised that they will not see the Syrian regime, and now the Syrian regime is inside Daraa. We were promised that it will be the Russian police forces that will be managing the area, yet that was never the case.
Yuri, with all of that in mind, right, here's my question. Why does Russia bother? What's in it for Russia?
Well, look, if you allow me just 2 seconds to react to what was directed to me, I have no illusions as to whether, Syrians in Idlib trust Russia. I think, frankly, that is not even the problem, because the problem here is that the issue of Idlib was created by both Russia and Turkey and a bunch of other actors, including Iran, including the Syrian government. And that kind of cauldron of a mix of groups that is now in Idlib, Turkey did that, kind of readily assisted Russia transporting all those groups into Idlib. So I think all parties contribute to this problem, and all parties are trying to resolve this now. But also, I came from Damascus and areas around Damascus a few days ago, and I have to say, look, while Syrians in Idlib do not trust the Russians, Syrians in Damascus and in the government-controlled areas do not necessarily trust Turkey. So that is, of course, that is a chicken and egg problem, or a problem that you can characterize in whatever way you want. But the bottom line here is that at the end of the day, everybody needs to sit down and talk to each other, whether you trust each other or not. It is about the guarantees. It is about the rules of the game. And Russians and Turks are trying to establish those rules of the games that could be acceptable to all the parties. And that is a very slow and a very painful process sometimes.
Danny Maki, does Damascus feel as empowered as ever, given where we are in the conflict?
Well, I would have to say that this moment in the Syria crisis, it's probably the best that Assad and the Syrian government have been at in terms of strength, manpower, momentum. But that doesn't say that they make all of the rules and all of the shots. You've got countries like Russia and Iran who have a big say in how policies are made, especially in Idlib, where the Russians ultimately will have a final decision on whether an offensive takes place or not. So it's difficult to say that, Assad's managed to turn the tide of the Syrian conflict, but the Iranians and the Russians' role in this allows them to have a lot of say over what policies are made when it influences other countries such as Turkey or such as Lebanon or Israel or other states. So there is an element of agency here. And look, the Russians in Daraa, for example, as was stated by your guest, they never said that the Syrian army and the Syrian government won't enter. They just said that they would guarantee that this deal would happen. And if you look at Daraa in comparison to Aleppo, for example, it was a much, much cleaner offensive, to be honest. I mean, the civilian casualties were far, far less than any other area. So Daraa was actually, more of an example of Russia being a power broker than it was using brute force, such as in Aleppo and other areas. I think that if there was a situation which happened in Idlib closer to Daraa than Aleppo, I think the people of Idlib would have taken that without a second thought, because what we fear for Idlib and what the region fears, and especially Turkey, is an Aleppo-type scenario, which will have calamitous effects on both the humanitarian aspect and Turkey's role. But finally, we'd have to say that Russia really does respect Turkish interests in Idlib.
Right.
If it wasn't for respecting Turkey's role, it wouldn't have actually went on with this and said, we'll give you more time and we'll assess this. And they could have had an offensive 3 months ago. But we all understand that Turkey has a very important role, and its national security is compromised in the Idlib situation. So taking that into account will mean that some sort of compromise and diplomatic agreement will have to be made on Idlib,
right,
whether it's now or whether it's in a month's time.
Rania, Daraa was cleaner than Aleppo, according to Danny. What do you think?
I'm sorry, Danny, that is not true. The catastrophes that have taken place in Daraa, when Daraa fell in the hands of the Russians and the regimes, were were absolutely horrible. There are entire cities that are down to the streets, to the ground. Busra al-Sham is down to the ground. They annihilated everybody, and so many people have had to go to the borders between Syria and Jordan, and then Jordan didn't let them in. So that's why they had to give in. Otherwise, they would not have given in to the Russians or to the Syrian regime. And as far as what your guest is saying about Russia respecting Turkish interest, I don't think that's true either, because Russia has several times broken the peace treaty before this last one and has shelled Idlib, has shelled Hama, even though there was agreement that there will be a ceasefire.
Although this is held so far, by and large, doesn't that show that the Russians have respected the deal that they signed with Turkey?
Perhaps, but they are saying that they want us to get the extremists out. And again, like I said to you before, there are families that have different members in different groups. So how are you, as a father or a mother, going to kick your son out?
It's hard to do, but it's still true that you can distinguish between, for example, the Free Syrian Army and HTS,
yes,
right?
you can, absolutely.
Right.
And it's not hard to distinguish between them by clothes, by ideology, by even the way they walk. It's not hard to distinguish them.
But would you accept that Hayat Tahrir Sham is a group that should not be a part of any solution in Syria?
I
and
absolutely
they need to be
agree,
kicked out,
and they should be, but not kicked out, because you can't kick someone out of their
So
own
what do you
nation.
do with them?
They have to be rehabilitated, and those that are not rehabilitated can go to jail. It's just as simple as that. You cannot hold millions of people accountable for a number of 15,000 members. You cannot make parents, families, children, women, and elderly pay for the mistakes of HTS.
Right. Ahmed Qasim Khan, let me ask you from the geopolitical perspective what this says about Syria in 2018, given that if President Erdogan wants to decide something regarding Syria, whether it's protecting Turkey's national interest or trying anything to do with Syria, he's not talking to Bashar al-Assad, he's talking to Vladimir Putin and Hassan Rouhani. What does that say?
Well, yes, President Erdogan is not talking to Bashar al-Assad, but Turkey is talking to the Syrian regime. This has been insinuated by many government people responsible for at different positions for different issues, including ministers in the past, that Turkey has been insinuated to talk to.
But ultimately, the people who call the shots, are they the Russians and the Iranians, while Assad is just grateful for whatever he's going to get out of them?
No, I don't think so. He's an actor. He's not perhaps as independent as he would like to. But nevertheless, he has his own priorities. He has the ability to manipulate Iranians and Russians. Not, of course, manipulate in the sense that he could get them to do whatever his bid is every time he tries. But there is also a balance between the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, and he can't play the two against each other. And he does that from time to time. It is obvious. It can be seen from developments on the ground. And you can't really, in realistic terms, you can't really blame him for doing that. After all, that regime is after its survival. And for that survival, to guarantee that survival, it's going to do anything, and it will get into any kind of deal. Nevertheless, Turkey, if it sees that as a facilitator for the future peace in Syria, and as an opportunity that would save people from getting shelled, killed, families from being uprooted, it will definitely talk to the regime at some level. Even though
maybe not officially.
If it is not going to be at the presidential level, I don't think that this is going to happen. But Turkey did talk to the Syrian regime on the sides of Astana, on the sides of other conferences, and Turkey will continue to talk to the regime, knowing that this is a factor.
Danny Maki, the Foreign Minister Walid Muallim, saying after Idlib, our target is east of the Euphrates, and that area must also return to Syrian sovereignty. Is he going to get what he wants?
I think they'll definitely look towards it. I'm not sure if he'll get what he wants in the long run, but that's definitely a very high priority on the Syrian government and on Russia's list, because, and I would even say that east of the Euphrates for Syria in the long term is possibly more important than Idlib, because Idlib is very complicated. You know, it's something which there's a lot of factors, a lot of different groups, a lot of actors, a lot of interests, and it's a very ugly situation. But east of the Euphrates, I mean, I don't think that Assad, knowing the individual that he is and the history of the region, will allow the SDF to control such a large part of Syria in the long term. That's definitely going to be an objective that he, the Russians, the Iranians will have. And we've seen a heightened Iranian presence in eastern Syria just for that particular reason, to keep an eye on what the SDF is doing, on the US presence in Tenef. East of the Euphrates, for Turkey, Assad, Russia and the Iranians is very high on the agenda, and I'm sure that this will be an issue for conflict well after the Idlib situation is agreed upon by the regional superpowers. But relating to how this fits in with Idlib, it's definitely monitor Idlib now and then focus on the east of the Euphrates after, as Walid al-Muallim said. And I would just like to remind you that around a month ago, and I'm sure that you know of this, the Idlib offensive was almost happening. You know, there was wide-scale shelling, there was troop deployments, and then it stopped. It stopped primarily because the Russians did not want to create a big problem with Turkey. So it does reiterate my previous point that the Russians have taken into consideration Turkish interests and concerns and actually acted to prevent a full-scale catastrophe kind of happening at that time.
Okay, so
and now
let's ask Rania.
You'll find an agreement on it.
Right. So, Rania, for better or for worse, yes, your initial goals might have been Assad must go and the war must take a certain direction or the regime must fall, but would you have to accept some sort of compromise position brokered by Russia and Turkey and others? Would you accept something that's not ideal but stops the killing?
For right now, maybe. And I'm talking now on my own behalf because I know that a lot of people in Idlib will say no. They would rather continue, whether it's a war or a fight or just a revolution. You have to understand something. The revolution was never just a rifle. It's an ideology that grew and grew, wanting equality, wanting freedom, and wanting dignity. And there's no way, no political solution, no military solution, there's no way anybody is going to be able to take that from the Syrian people. They will continue, whether it's with the rifle or with the pen or with just a voice. I want to say something about Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad, like Dr. here said, yes, he's not just an actor, but he's an employee rather. He's an employee of the Russians, and he cannot make any decisions on his own until he's giving the permission. You can see him on television, how he's greeting the Russian president, and how right behind him is a military officer from the Russian regime, which is not protocol. Who should be greeting the president of Russia is the Syrian regime, yet who is always greeting him? It's the Russian regime. What we are seeing in Syria now is some sort of an occupation, I want to say. So the Russians now have taken over Damascus, Daraa, the south, and Turkey is now trying to protect Idlib from being demolished. And the east is for the Americans, and the west is for the Alawites, and the entire country is now in several pieces. But that doesn't mean.
I have to disagree with that.
But that doesn't mean by any chance. That doesn't mean by any chance. Allow me to continue. That the Syrian people will accept a halfway solution.
Okay. Danny wants to respond.
We will never accept halfway solutions.
Danny, come in and respond. We're out of time, but in under 30 seconds, if you can, please. Danny, go ahead.
Well, look, there is no Russian military presence in Damascus at all. The Russian military presence is strictly near the border areas and further towards Idlib. And the West is not entirely an Alawite population. There are Christians, there are Sunnis, there's Shia. There's all manner of people living in West Syria. It's not just an Alawite kind of statelet, as your guest is suggesting. Russia does not run Syria, but it has a lot of influence over what happens.
And you know what? The next time I invite Yuri onto the program, I'd like to get into what's Russia's end game here. What's the thinking? What's their long-term goal? I think that's going to spin us off into another 10-minute discussion, and I don't have that time because I have to move on to another segment. But for the moment, I apologize if everybody didn't get an opportunity to say all that they wanted to say. But it was an interesting discussion. Rania Kaysar, Danny Maki, Ahmed Qasim Khan, and Yuri Barman, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the program, the last time Ingushetia lost some land, hundreds of people died. Could it happen again? And Zimbabwe's government bans protests over the economy. Are we seeing a new economic disaster for the cash-strapped country?
We do not want anything aggressive. We only demand our rights. These people have gathered here out of desperation. Local authorities made people rally to protect the state's unity.
It's a territorial dispute that started with the fall of the Soviet Union and has now broken out into mass protests. The tension is between these two Russian republics in the northern Caucasus, Chechnya and Ingushetia. Thousands of people have taken to the streets in Ingushetia, upset that their local government agreed with their neighbor to swap empty plots of farmland. When the province's leader tried to calm demonstrators, he was attacked and had to run. Well, to discuss this and find out what's going on there, let's join Peter Eltsoff, who's at the National Defense University. Peter, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. Help me understand why people in Ingushetia are so angry about this.
Well, we need to remember that the Caucasus, the northern Caucasus, is an extremely volatile area with numerous nationalities and very arbitrary borders created by the communist government. They created them, then they abolished these republics, and of course the Ingush people are extremely unhappy because they lost some of their land, which was given to the Chechens.
Is it because the Chechens got a far better deal than Ingushetia?
Definitely they did got a far better deal. We need to remember the two Russian Chechen wars of the 1990s and early 2000. And Kadyrov basically became a kind of, the leader of Chechnya, became a kind of a king of the northern Caucasus. He feels that he can recreate this like North Caucasian republic, which existed for some time after the Russian Revolution between 1917 and early 1920s. So he really has a much better deal. He has a tremendous amount of money coming from Moscow all the time. He basically doesn't obey the Russian law. And I think at this point of time, the Kremlin is a kind of afraid of him because they understand that they have to appease him. They created a kind of a monster within the Russian Federation, a kind of a semi-independent republic.
Okay, so we have the parliament in Ingushetia annulling the vote, saying they're going to reconsider. But in reality, is that ever possible? Given what you mentioned, that Kadyrov is so strong and the balance of power is more with the Chechens, would it actually happen that Ingushetia would say, hey, we don't want this deal anymore?
I seriously very much doubt it. Kadyrov has a personal militia by rough estimates between 15 and 25,000 people. If these people turn against Ingushetia or, God forbid, against the Russian army, we may see something much worse than we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s. This is really, I would call it a powder keg, the powder keg of the Caucasus and maybe of Eurasia in general. And I doubt very much that Ingushetia will be given anything back in return.
Yeah. It's fascinating because people look at the two peoples, right? And religiously, they're similar. Linguistically, they're similar. Ethnically, they are somewhat similar. Culturally, very similar. Yet, there are deep-lying tensions. Is this the thing to sort of reignite a lot of old tensions?
Definitely. And most tragically, after this list of things which unite them, the thing which one would think would unite them the most, the fact that both nationalities were treated very cruelly by Stalin. Both were deported in 1944 and accused of collaborating with Nazis. And then the republic, it was at some point one republic. It was called the Chechen Ingush Soviet Socialist Republic. It was abolished. But today, yes, I mean, this is the same story that we saw in former Yugoslavia when people turned against each other and then they're saying, how did it happen? We lived in peace. This is unfortunately the reality of the collapse of big empires. And this is also gives an argument to some people that the only solution there is actually to have a very authoritarian state, which the Russian Empire provides right now, the new Russian ceasefire.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, they're just going to all be in perpetual conflict. You have to remember, it's not just two nationalities. We're talking about dozens of nationalities living in the North Caucasus.
Right. And so we have Vladimir Putin saying, hey, you guys must use dialogue, not force. We want you to talk. Is this sincere, or would the whole land swap have been agreed with Moscow a long time ago before they even decided on it?
I'm sure it was 100% designed in Moscow, because this kind of decision in modern Russia, particularly the borders, which Vladimir Putin is very much concerned with, he famously said that the Bolsheviks laid a time bomb underneath the Russian Federation by creating those administrative divisions based on ethnic principles. So I'm 100% positive that this decision was made directly in Moscow and most likely personally by Vladimir Putin.
And related to this, when Amnesty International went to try and find out what's going on in Ingushetia, I'm sure you're aware that their researcher had quite an ordeal. Have a little listen to what Oleg Kozlovsky had to say.
We arrived at a field somewhere out of town. We stopped there and they told me to get out of the car and lie down on the ground. They threatened that if I tried to run, they would kill me. I did just that. I lay on the ground. They told me to place my hands behind my back.
So, Peter, what's going on there? Amnesty goes. Tell me, what does that say about Ingushetia itself and how the place is run, and what can happen to you if you try to ask questions?
You know, it's a story in the entirety of Northern Caucasus. I personally spent a lot of time in Dagestan. Basically, the Northern Caucasus has turned into a kind of a police state. And it's the Kadyrov's people, it's the FSB, it's the local authorities of specific republics. The last thing what they want to see, they want some like civil rights activists and NGO people. So I'm not surprised by this story. This is what's happening not just in Chechnya and Ingushetia, it's happening all over the Northern Caucasus, basically.
Okay, and what kind of, if we have to understand the political reality of the Northern Caucasus and all the little sort of micro-statelets that are all autonomous states within Russia, what's the general trend? Is it not looking good?
It's not looking good. I would say it can be stable right now under a very authoritarian political regime, and that's what Moscow is definitely trying to do. Given the situation, if Russia gets another leader, if there is a change of allegiances between, because, for example, the relations between Kadyrov and Putin are deeply personal. It's the relation of a father and a son. If this link somehow breaks, everything is going to get on fire. And basically, yes, the situation is extremely volatile. And as we saw in the 90s and early 2000s, it could cause basically a catastrophe and possibly even the disintegration of Russia.
So if there's no way for Yunusbek Yevkurov to reverse on this decision to swap this land with the Chechens, and his people are still angry, he seems to be boxed in, what does he actually do then to placate his people and to maybe even try and keep the deal?
I think they will try to downplay it. They hope that the Ingush people are not as ready to go fight as the Chechens were in the 90s. And they will basically realize the reality of their life. And they hope just to play down. And you know what's remarkable? The Russian media right now, for example, does not say a word about what's happening in the Caucasus. They keep talking about the Ukrainian crisis, about Syria, about, I don't know, the United States. They don't say a word about it because they're clearly very afraid. And for example, some of the social networks in Ingushetia, I've heard, have been shut down because they want basically to pacify those protests. So far, they were like relatively peaceful. They are hoping just to basically calm them down.
Is there ever any likelihood that we could see Chechnya and Ingushetia actually fight each other over this?
Well, I hope not. Honestly, that would be a pretty catastrophic scenario because the Russian troops would have to be involved. I am reluctant to give those kind of prognosis. Of course, everything is possible. I don't think it's quite likely under the current government of Vladimir Putin. They will find some cash deal probably as well, because that's been, of course, a very important instrument of political influence in the Northern Caucasus as well.
Well, yeah, it was a land swap with a lot of intrigue surrounding it. A lot of us trying to understand why now and why are people so angry. And I thank you very much, Peter, for helping us demystify some of it. It's good to have you on the Newsmakers.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Zimbabwe is pulling out all the stops to prevent nationwide protests against the failing economy. Police arrested hundreds of activists and members of labor unions ahead of planned demonstrations this week, and then decided to ban any gatherings due to concerns about a cholera outbreak. Well, protest or no protest, the fact remains that this kind of outrage can be sparked by something as little as a new tax on electronic money transfers. And the anger is being fueled by a real bread and butter issue, the actual shortage of bread, fuel and medicine. With more on this story, here's Haider Abbasi.
Huge queues for petrol, empty shelves, and shops closing down. For people in Zimbabwe, the days of high inflation and economic chaos are back.
Prices are ridiculous, they are too much. An ordinary man like me, from the street, I don't think in the next week or so I can afford it.
Last week, the government introduced a 2% tax on all electronic cash payments. It was hoped it would raise much needed government revenue, but it's triggered panic, and in just a few days, prices have tripled. Unions have called the levy illegal.
I'm tired, I'm angry, and I think somebody should be made accountable. In this case, our government.
There was hope when President Emerson Mnangagwa was elected in July. He promised to fix the economy, attract foreign investment, and create jobs. But that hope is vanishing. It seems Zimbabwe can't escape the legacy of Robert Mugabe. The former president, who ruled for 30 years, oversaw the ruin of the economy. There was hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and food shortages. The situation was so bad that Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency and adopted the US dollar. But there aren't enough dollars in circulation.
So businesses that need to acquire foreign currency to buy inputs, for example, from outside, have to go to the black market, where premium, as I said, are averaging about 250%.
And that black market is thriving. A litre of cooking oil is being sold on the street for $12. The usual cost is around $4. The government says the tax is necessary and that the situation is under control. But with inflation at 155%, rising unemployment and food shortages, many people aren't convinced. Some analysts say the government isn't making the right kind of reforms.
The government should downsize. Government should reduce at least by 100,000 people the number of people on the payroll. And if they could do that, the budget deficit wouldn't be so big.
In the end, it was economic mismanagement that led to the downfall of Mugabe. Will President Mnangagwa's measures eventually work? Or is Zimbabwe's economy facing another collapse? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our guest now. Joining me now from Harare is Michael Kandukutu. He's a director at the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. Michael, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Tell me why you think this transaction tax is a bad idea.
Okay, thank you very much for having me on the show. Firstly, I want to bring out to you that we have observed as the ZCTU that the transaction tax is meant to deal with an odious debt, a debt that we have not created, a debt that we are for sure are aware that has not been used for the advancement of the lives of the poor and the general population. Secondly, we are saying that the transaction tax is a bad idea because in terms of its propagation, in terms of its formulation, there was no consultation between the lawmakers and the citizens. So it comes to us as workers, to us as citizens, as a shock.
And when the government says that that 2% tax will be used for roads, for health, for education, why don't you believe them? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, thank you very much for that question. What I would want to highlight is that this government has got a history. It is the government that we've had for the past 37 years. It is the same government that adopted a dual economy from Britain, where we had two economies, one for the white and one for the blacks. But when you looked at the two economies, we had a healthy facility system that was functional. We had roads that were very passable as compared to now. We have other schemes that are creating funds for the Zimbabwean government. For instance, we have got taxes that motorists are paying on the road to Zinara, and those taxes have not been used to rehabilitate our roads. Our roads are full of potholes and mostly impassable. You look at the health delivery system, citizens are having to pay in order for them to access health delivery services. And that is not translated into good services. That what would actually equate to the monies that we are paying. So there is a lot of mistrust between the government, the workers, and the general populace.
Michael, the last time we saw these massive queues, the gas shortages, the supermarket shortages, it was 2008. There was economic collapse in Zimbabwe. There was hyperinflation. Are we seeing something similar going to happen now?
Yes, I think from the announcements which were made by the Reserve Bank Governor, Mangudya, and the Minister of Finance on the 2nd of October, where they both announced fiscal and monetary policies. From the announcements that the two made, it then struck out all the confidence that the citizens, the business, and the workers had. From the day of the announcement, we began to see queues forming in fuel stations, and we also began to see goods disappearing from shop shelves. We also began to see citizens preparing themselves for hard times to come. And how do citizens prepare themselves for hard times to come? They prepare themselves by hoarding, by buying in bulk what is available of the basics. So this is what we then witnessed.
Michael, are you being a bit too harsh on the government? I mean, if somebody had been in a coma for the past year and they woke up and they started watching this segment, they'd think that we're talking about Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. Mugabe's gone. Mnangagwa is your leader, and they're saying, give us a chance. We know we inherited a mess from Mugabe and the cult of Mugabe and the people around him. Give us a chance to fix things. Are you maybe being a bit too harsh on Mnangagwa?
Well, honestly, I would want to say that the Mnangagwa that we had soon after Operation Restore Legacy and the one that we have today is totally different. The one that we had on the inauguration is a totally different one, because on inauguration, he was indeed saying that the voice of the people is the voice of God. He was saying that he was going to be the voice of the people. He was saying that he was going to be a servant of the people. He was saying that he was going to be a democratic leader. And a democratic leader practices democracy, which means participation, which means consultation. And this has not happened. What we start to see are the old traits of the First Republic. They are referring to the 37 years Zimbabwe that we had as the First Republic. And now that we are in a Second Republic, which is in transition. We would want to see new traits that are starting to take place, traits of consultation. We are coming from a background that we are an organization, a ZCTU, that fights for social justice. And social justice has two factors, economic and political. And we see the new government lacking in both the political and economic factors. So we are not being unfair in our judgment.
Can you protest at the moment? If ZCTU wanted to take to the streets tomorrow, would you be allowed to?
Unfortunately not. What has since happened is that it also appears that the Zimbabwe Republic Police is acting as if it's an appendage of the ruling party ZANU-PF, because just on the 11th of October, we had intended to strike to voice our concern on the text, to say that the text was ill-timed. The text was actually promoting traits and characters of ASAP2. The police reacted by banning all the demonstrations, which is our democratic right in terms of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Section 59. But the police went on to arbitrarily ban all our demonstrations. They went on to arrest about 36 people who participated or who were about to participate in the demonstrations. So it appears to us that the environment is not yet democratized enough for us as citizens, for us as Zimbabweans to enjoy our constitutional rights as given by the Constitution. The police continue to violate our rights. In fact, the situation that we are now facing would actually similarize a political and army state.
They say that it's because of cholera, that they don't want the spread of cholera. That's why they're banning protests for the moment. It's not because they're trying to take away your democratic rights.
It is unfortunate that they refer to cholera. There has been a number of gatherings where the president himself has officiated. There have been graduation ceremonies that have been done at about 3 universities in this very time where they are talking about cholera. Football matches, which actually congregate or which gather a lot of people, are taking place. They have not banned football matches. They have not banned people going to their religious churches to gather, where they gather in thousands. All these people are gathering. They have not banned people from participating in ZANU-PF meetings or rallies. The ban only applies to organizations like ours, which is fighting for the democratic rights of workers and citizens. So it is unfortunate that there is a selective application of where cholera will apply and a selective application of where cholera will not apply.
Maybe cholera only spreads amongst government critics, and maybe this is a medical breakthrough. Very finally, all jokes aside, looking at the situation of Zimbabwe right now, IMF, World Bank, all in discussions with Zimbabwe in order to reduce the debt. The economy is wobbling, and this is a major test for Mnangagwa. What do you want to happen from the outside? Because if I remember correctly, whenever people from the outside tried to do something, whether it was the United Kingdom, the United States, even the AU in general, then President Mugabe would say, you see, they want to take away our sovereignty and take away our independence, right? So, given that there's this sort of delicate political balance you have to have, where any outside investment, intrusion, politically and otherwise, is seen as some sort of intrusion over sovereignty, what do you want from the outside world? What should they do?
Thank you. I think from where I'm coming from, when we look at the IMF and we look at the World Bank, we see again that propensity to go out to the agents of neoliberalism. We are saying before any debt can be given to the country, we want an audit of the odious debt that the country is. Who took the money and where did it go? The government must account for the money. Where did it go? And then thereafter, what is now happening is that this money from the IMF and the World Bank is not coming free of charge. It is again going on the poor Zimbabwean citizen, poor Zimbabwean taxpayer, and before that money is given, before that loan is extended to Zimbabwe, we want to know what has happened to the other loans that the government has borrowed. How have they been used? There must be an audit of the odious debt. We need that support.
Okay. Michael Kandukutu, it's been good to have you on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, from Bollywood to the BJP, we look at how the Me Too movement is holding India's most powerful men to account. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.